You can be in charge of printing that. I'll be in charge of getting the beer. Welcome, Chris, to another episode of the Purple Fringe.
Yes, indeed it is. This is episode number 6. Pretty exciting because we've just had the National Association of Broadcasters Conference. Show, sorry, it's not a conference, it's a show. The NAB show, as we will call it from this point on. And it is the big show where everybody showcases their amazing technology. Everybody being, of course, the camera and audio broadcast field. And that also filters down these days into the low end of the high end, or the high end of the low end, depending how you want to look at it. And there's always lots of exciting things on offer. So tell us a little bit, John, about what you thought of NAB on the whole.
Overall, well, I say overall, we aren't actually at the end of NAB yet. It's actually still going, but nothing seems to have been released in the last 24 hours, so I don't think there's going to be any major announcements. We might come back in a week or two and sort of go, oh, wow, did you see the whatever that got released at the end of the show? But so far, over the first couple of days, I think it's been a much quieter, less hectic NAB than in previous years. I saw an article on Red Shark News that basically stated that it had, in fact, been a less hectic year because there weren't as many cameras being released. Blackmagic didn't release any cameras, and they normally like to release half a dozen, it seems. And most other camera manufacturers, people like Sony, they didn't release anything new with the notable exception of a higher-end E&G camera. It was just a quieter show, and I think it was less stressful, and people were, from what I saw at least, more keen to enjoy themselves and look more to the long term. They look, a year ahead instead of this constant release cycle that we've been used to the last couple of years.
Yeah, and having a constant release cycle like there has been in the last 3 or 4 years with the move, it even goes longer than that. It's sort of, I'd say, even 7 or 8 years, because we moved to HD, then we moved to 4K, and there was a lot of change that sort of happened very quickly. I mean, it was suddenly all about like the shallow depth of field and then it was, there's been something every year that's been quite an impact on the prosumer market. So I think it's a nice indication to us professionals that the cameras we've got at the moment that are sort of starting to show up as we speak from last year's NAB and throughout last year obviously being released are the cameras that we can sit on for a little while. Yeah. And that there isn't too much new in the bag. Yes, there's HDR stuff, but with log apparently you can sort of resolve a fair bit of that already, and a lot of the cameras do have that.
Yeah, the HDR stuff was seemingly very much in its infancy. There's issues around standards and scopes and that sort of thing, and they're coming out in the wash. But I think people are prepared to slow down a little bit and really spend some time getting this right, despite the fact that it does seem to be 26 HDR standards. But I don't think people are stressed about being first to market anymore.
Well, fingers crossed, we'll get some standards down in the next few years and see HDR, high dynamic range, which is sort of the step that everybody is saying is the equivalent high definition to standard definition. This is the next step forwards. Yep. I've got my own reservations on that, but we'll save those for another day. And that's just through a bit of experience of playing around with it. But I'll talk about my experiences on another show.
I guess the only other thing which we don't have in the run sheet, Chris, was 8K. It didn't really rear its head as much as we thought it perhaps might. There was some stuff from Canon, but they were very forthright about it. They basically sort of said, yep, we've got this stuff. We've got something that can capture 8K. We've got something that can play back 8K. But it's very much an indication of what we're going to do in the future. It was in no means a product ready to ship. So I think, again, people have sort of taken their foot off the accelerator just a little bit. Because 8K, there are so many requirements that it brings that people are probably just not ready after they potentially spend a lot of money getting up to snuff for 4K.
Yeah, and the truth is that the 4K we've got already isn't quite resolved in my view. Like, we're still doing work in order to get the images nice and sharp and nice and clear. And, I think it's more about getting a sensor that's downscaling in camera and giving you a nice solid 4K. I mean, you look how good HD is now compared to where it was, especially in the prosumer range, 8 years ago, 7 years ago when the HD camera started, first flowing to market, especially on the lower end. So it's definitely time for 4K to mature and give us the options to reframe so that we can release everything in HD. Look, Star Wars, that movie we all love to hate, was finished in 2K. Close to HD. They didn't finish it in 4K. Star Wars is a 2K film. It's an HD film, effectively. And if that gives you a little bit of an insight to, I think the IMAX version probably had a little bit more resolution for those sequences involved with it. But, the film workflow was HD. And if it's good enough for those guys, it's pretty much good enough for us, I reckon.
Yes.
Acquire in 4K by all means. But I think people have realized now that we shoot in 4K and we reframe and we get it, but we could still get away with shooting HD.
Yeah,
like halfway through a shoot yesterday, we got to the point where we were down to 9 minutes worth of cards left. It was like, do we dump and risk not having a backup copy on set, or do we actually switch to HD and keep shooting? It's like, well, we're not going to actually lose much as long as we frame it up perfectly. We're not going to lose much switching to HD. And I think that's the thing. You would never switch back to SD.
No,
for
definitely
instance.
not.
Unless
you're the AFL and they still like to broadcast in HD, but again, that's another matter for another day.
So yeah, there was a lot of 4K talk still, which I think is nice. It's mature 4K talk.
Let's get into it, Chris. There weren't as many announcements as in previous years, but there definitely were some interesting things coming out of NAB this year, especially for the high end of low end media production, as we are. And the first thing here, Chris, was something that I think is very much in your wheelhouse. It was a new Panasonic camera. We talked about the Sony Z150 a few weeks ago. This is very similar from what I can ascertain. It's the same sort of form factor and it has many of the same features. What are your thoughts, Chris?
Well, I think it's back to that thing of we were joking that the X150, which is Sony camera, was the sort of unexciting camera because it was the stock standard kind of point and shooter for that intermediate market. And this looks like the same kind of thing. It's a 1 inch sensor, so it's a relatively sizable sensor.
Sorry to break in, Chris. I should mention there are actually two cameras, but they're very similar.
Yes, so there's a UX180 and a UX90.
Yep.
They're very, very similar in what they can create as far as their sensor and what they capture. What was the difference between the two?
Basically, that the higher end model, the 180 model, could do 60p or 50p in our country, but 60p in Ultra HD, and then the lower end model, the 90, would be 30p or 25 at 4K. Sorry, not 4K, Ultra HD.
Great. So it's really just the frame rate difference. One can do double the frame rate.
Yeah.
Is effectively it, and you pay half as much again.
Yeah.
But the lens on it is a Leica lens. For those of you who are into lenses, you'll know that's a fantastic history behind that company. Panasonic's lenses are always pretty sharp, I've got to say. It's a 15 zoom. We don't actually know what that's equivalent of because we haven't got the specs.
15 times something, but
we don't know what the wide reference is. But that sounds like it's equivalent to the X150. It's got 3 ND filters built in, switchable, which is always a great thing for being able to, just get that sun dealt with. It's got lots of buttons on the side and custom controls. It's a very, very similar looking camera to the X150 with, of course, a bit of a throwback to the old HVX 200, was it? That HD camera, and even the DVX 100 that are, the original DV camera that came out in the sort of 2000s, early 2000s. So it's a very Panasonic-y looking camera, but it has an iris control, it has a zoom, and it has a focus, and it has everything at your fingertips ready to roll with a 1 inch sensor. So what is going to differentiate this camera from the Sony X150
You keep saying X, it's a Z.
Sorry, the Z150, yep. Not the X, I'll stop saying that.
Yep.
The Z150 is going to be the fact that it hopefully will have a wider aperture on the lens. If it's got f1.8 at its wide end, that's letting more light in and getting more use for that 1 inch sensor, that's its selling point. And I'm going to hold off on my Z150 until I actually see the specs on what this is.
An interesting camera. It doesn't look like it's going to ship immediately. It looks like there might be a little bit of time there. If you're desperate for a camera now, get the Sony. It's not quite out yet, but it will be shortly. Otherwise, if you do have a bit of time to do a bit more research, it's probably worth waiting for it just a little bit, just to see which one comes out on top. The other thing, I guess, is how does this differ from what they released last year in the DVX 200, which is still a very nice camera, and it's got the fancy red accents, which is great. The main difference here is the sensor. So that was a 4/3 4/3 of an inch sensor. This is a little bit smaller, so that other camera is still positioned as the higher end camera. You're still going to pay a bit more for it, and you're probably going to get a slightly sexier look with the 4/3 sensor, and you won't have the red accents, which is really important. But apart from that, it's not that different. They're very similar in terms of feature sets from what I can ascertain.
Yeah. So worth having a look at. If you want something that's might be a bit more price competitive, certainly that $3,000 UX90, that's US dollar though.
Yeah,
obviously.
so the word on the street is that the higher end, the 180, will be under 4,000. We don't know how far under. And then the 90 will be under 3,000 US. Again, we don't know how far under. But for that sort of price, that becomes a pretty interesting thing. The 180, for $1,000 more, I guess you've got to really want the ability to shoot double the frame rate at
4K
Ultra HD.
because you can, of course, drop back to HD and be shooting high frame rate
Yeah.
still. Anyway, moving on because it's still a little bit of a in the shadows camera at the moment.
Yeah.
We're looking forward to seeing what Panasonic say with that, but not much on the Sony front. JVC we spoke about last week, and they basically told us everything before it was at NAB, so that stays the same. There was Canon, nothing really that exciting apart from their announcement of an 8K recorder or ability to pipe out 8K from.
Yeah, it was more a tech demo, I suppose. than
Yeah,
anything else.
it was tech demo, so it wasn't
Yeah.
actually confirmed.
Yeah, it was basically we can capture in 8K, we can play it back, we can monitor it, all that sort of stuff. And they were very upfront about it. That they didn't pretend like it was some new product. It was, here's where we're going in the future.
And talking about the future and talking about megapixels,
Oh,
a
we're
camera
onto that, are
with
we?
a 755, let me say that again, a 755 megapixel raw video capture mode. Bow, bow.
Yeah.
What is going on at 300 frames per second with 16 stops of dynamic range? What what is this camera,
mythical
John?
beast? This would be the Lytro Cinema camera, which actually was announced a little bit before NAB, but we've just sort of let it simmer for a little while to find out a little bit more information about the camera itself.
Now, Lytro have got an interesting history because they kind of started off in the consumer market with this little lipstick, we call it lipstick camera. It looks like a big, chunky, oversized
Extruded square, basically.
extruded square, and you just held it and you pointed the click button on the back to take photos and stuff. It reminds me of those little click LED torches, but
flashlight,
bigger.
Yeah, yeah, basically.
And it would take a photo of something, but it would allow you to refocus the shot after you took it. So you could take a shot of some food. It was particularly good for food, or a close-up of a beer label or something like that. And you didn't know what you just had to sort of hit the button and it would capture it, and you could sort of... But it never actually gave you any real depth of field. Like, it was a real
the
shallow...
sensor was too small and the lens wasn't fast enough, and it was low megapixels, and it was a weird form factor, and it was a tech demo that got released to the public as far as I can tell.
And some people bought them. I saw one on eBay the other day for $60. I nearly bought it. I was like, it could be worth just to have this for fun. But then I looked at the use case and I was like, But Lytro have obviously learnt a lot from this. And they are a really good sort of research and development company as far as understanding light and understanding processing of light. And they've gone next level with this idea.
So essentially, this is a camera for visual effects work. So the idea is that you have this big honking camera, and we'll get to the big honking part in a moment. I've got this big honking camera. You shoot whatever it is that you're shooting, and you have the ability to pull out information based on the Z-axis or the depth from the camera itself. So why is that useful? Well, basically because you can do green screen work without green screen. So you could have a couple of people and their dog hanging out in front of the camera, and then the forest behind them. And this camera would acquire enough data to basically say, okay, there is this Z depth information for the people and the dog, and there's also some for the forest behind them. Let's set some sort of separation between those two and just pull out the data of the people and the dog and get rid of the forest. So that, again, essentially means you can green screen or composite stuff without a green screen, which is kind of cool. It has some downsides, though. This is a seriously amazing camera.
It's 2
in many
meters long.
respects.
It's bigger than
over 2 meters long.
At the size of the Hubble telescope.
It's a little bit like some sort of Canon in terms of the way it looks.
As in old school Canon, like you had
like,
on ships in the 300-400s. Yeah,
it is huge. And in terms of its requirements, I suppose that they are huge as well. So this thing is, again, capturing 755 megapixels per shot worth of information. 300 frames a second. The reality is probably more like 70 megapixels of that is usable, which is still insane, but you're not going to actually be using the full 755 megapixels each time. Much like the original camera, it had a higher megapixel rating, but you could only actually use a certain amount of that data.
So it's 10 times less data. That's by the time you're finished with it.
Well, that's what the estimates are at this stage.
Does it do this with internal processing?
I'm not entirely sure how it does this, but I do know a few things. It's recording 300 gigabytes a second worth of data, which, if you just stop and think about that, that's mental. Because if you go out and buy, we talked about quite a few episodes ago when we were chatting about storage, we talked about RAIDs, and I was talking about the Pegasus R6 and the R8 and stuff like that. And these are like 6 and 8 drive RAIDs, and they, if you're lucky, might do a gigabyte a second. This is doing 300 gigabytes a second,
and that's for about 18. I just did the maths. Roughly about 18 terabytes a minute.
Yes, it's
yes, that is right.
Yeah, so you get 30. If you go out and buy a 4 terabyte hard drive, you get 13 seconds worth of footage. Thereabouts. So if you do the math on consumer level gear, and this is not consumer level gear, but if it was consumer level gear, you'd be spending about $1,000 for every minute worth of acquired footage. Now, that's ignoring all the proprietary interfaces and redundancy and the fact that it's SSDs most probably, I would have thought.
In parallel. Oh, look, it's a tool that's looking to the future.
Yeah, look, it is amazing, don't get me wrong, but there are some definite restrictions on this. The other thing is that there isn't a computer powerful enough to actually process this data. So what actually happens is you acquire your source footage, it gets thrown up into the cloud.
The cloud.
And when I say thrown up, it's more like a bulldozer pushes it slowly up a hill to get into the cloud.
18 terabytes up the hill for that 60 seconds you captured.
And then Google spins up a few CPU cycles, a few thousand CPU cycles, and actually processes this data. A lot of companies have policies against this sort of thing, which I'm just thinking about this now. A lot of companies won't let you put, especially movie companies, sensitive data like your rushes up in the cloud to begin with. So there's an issue there potentially.
Look, it's a tech demo of a camera. Look, this thing is a piece of technology that says if some crazy piece of laser optic storage came into play in the next 20 years and we're suddenly able to have terabytes of storage and we wanted a camera to basically take advantage of that, we could potentially capture a full 3D where everything is in space in a very clever, amazing way where we could refocus and basically capture the light photons in time and space, which is cool.
Yeah, and I'm interested to know, and they probably will never release this, but about their technology in terms of the codecs they're using, because being a VFX camera, it's got to be RAW because otherwise it's not a VFX camera. And at that stage, you want to go to lossless RAW because this is a ridiculous amount of data. So I'm interested about the B frames and P frames in the traditional sense, and then with the addition of this sort of Z axis data or Z axis data, how those sort of frame technologies for looking at the differences between frames and all this sort of stuff, how that works once you add a third dimension to it. So there could be some really cool white papers about how this actually comes together, because that compression technology can be tricky enough at the best of times to explain to mere mortals, let alone adding a third dimension to it.
Yeah, look, I think, to be honest, this is purely a tech demo camera. There will be some spin-off technology from this based on the research they've done.
Yeah.
And good on them for actually going through with it and building this thing just to make people like us go, what? And in fact, everybody.
There'll be some movies that use it. The promo video I found a little bit laughable because people kept saying, oh, we didn't need to decide on our focus now. We could just do it later. I'm like, yeah, but you're capturing 300 gigabytes a second. Who's the poor bastard who has to deal with that? If you go and shoot,
focus puller.
People. One of the big issues these days is people let the cameras roll when they really shouldn't. They should button on and off. Imagine if you did that with this thing. It'd be, oh my God, petabytes and petabytes, zettabytes Would be, kind of crazy. Anyway.
Talking of Z-axis, I'm going to briefly bring up the DJI Osmo, which is a little candlestick camera you run around with. It's like a Steadicam.
Gimbal on a stick.
Gimbal on a stick. Doesn't that sound amazing? The problem with running around with a gimbal on a stick is that when you're bouncing around as you're walking, its up and down axis kind of, has this sort of push and pull effect where it can't quite stabilize your walking, and it sort of has a up and down and sort of in and out kind of feel to your walking, unless you walk like you're, tiptoeing down a corridor.
Yep.
So to compensate with this, they listen to a lot of the complaints of people saying, oh, look, when we're walking around, it's not perfect. And they've made this spring-loaded Z-axis dampener, which is effectively you screw onto the unit. It's $120 and the camera pops on the end. And for a unit that only costs about 1,100 Australian dollars. What is it in America? It's cheaper. It's like 800 US, isn't it?
Cheaper than that again. I think it's like $6.99 or something US.
Yeah, so a candlestick little camera.
Depending on which camera you get, there are several cameras.
Yeah, that you walk around with this new little arm on it that sort of extends it out a little bit, turns it into a sort of a zigzag, and it will give you... Well, the people who own them already picked one up at NAB and had a walk around with it and were like, oh, yeah, this solves largely, not perfectly, but largely solves the problem. And for a piece of technology that's so cheap, I think this Osmo unit is a killer.
Yeah, look, I'm looking at picking a few up as journalism cams because a lot more of the journalism industry is moving towards this one-man band sort of thing, and it's a nice camera for that. It's got the depth of field because it's not a super large sensor. It's got the stabilization, so anything that can help that even more is going to be a positive in my book.
And it has a button that switches between selfie mode and...
That's the other reason I think it's good as a journalism camera, because Phil can report.
There's a little battery now that you can pop in your pocket as well and run a little cable to the base unit, and that will give you up to 5 hours of operation. And I do like the idea of pocket batteries where, you just have a cable running up your sleeve or whatever, and then you've got, your 5 or 6 hours rather than trying to build it, especially with something which you're holding around like that.
Yeah.
It's quite a, even the lightest of cameras, when you're holding them awkwardly for a Steadicam style thing, become quite heavy.
Yeah, very quickly.
It's only about the weight of a bottle of beer, I guess. So if you just maybe chuck a VB label on it, maybe you wouldn't notice. Yeah. We do have beers here today. It's great. Okay, let's move on to 3D cameras.
3D cameras, drink.
Oh, gee. Yeah, hang on. That's a drink offense, isn't it?
Oh, immersive video. 360 degree.
Immersive
VR.
That's another drink
whatever
offense.
drink. Yep.
Yep.
Teradek, who I'm sure they make other things, but I know them because they do wireless video transmitters.
They do, and
they cost a lot of money.
They do little recorders as well. They do a series of things.
Yes, mostly expensive things. But this thing, in fact, the interview I saw, he commented on the fact that they normally do expensive things and this thing was cheaper, which I found amusing and interesting. This is for VR, 360 degree, immersive, whatever the heck you want to call it, video, but also doing it live. So it's a box. And it's an interesting box. It's got 4 HDMI inputs, so stick your GoPros into that. And then it's got 4 USB powers, so stick your GoPros into that to power the GoPros. So you basically stick, 4 GoPros, put them vertical, point them in 4 different directions, run them into this device. It does the stitching in real time, and then it can use either a monitor or an iPad to beam out that information, and then you can pan around and have a look. And it's nothing new in what it actually produces, but it's doing it live, which is new.
And giving you a live preview to be able to preview what your 360 video is looking like on the fly.
Yeah.
So you can have a quick sweep around and go, John, you're in the shot. Hold it a bit around. That's better.
Of course I'm in the shot, Chris. It's 360 degree video. It's one of the problems with it.
When are you not in the shot?
Yeah.
And it's looking like quite a good little unit.
It's $3,000 US. So it's cheaper than many of their other products, but it's still not cheap.
But it's the brain of something that you can replace your cameras on, which is kind of nice.
Yeah.
It's nice to think if your GoPros get superseded by something that's less noisy, has a better lens on it, has, a better low light capability, that you could swap the cameras out into something that, worked a bit better. The only problem I've got with it, especially with GoPros, is they're not frame syncable. They don't have a sync input.
Gen lock.
And if they don't have a gen lock, and this is the ability to make the frames capture at exactly the same moment in time, your 60 frames a second that you're capturing, or your 30 frames, I assume you'd be running at 60, are going to be, which is the highest HDMI, or is it? No, you can do 100 over HDMI, can't you?
I've lost track of HDMI
I
standards.
don't think that the GoPro's output it though. So if you were outputting even at 60 frames a second, if something flies around your cameras, it might be that it's half in one frame but not in the next one because it's capturing the detail slightly later. So
Yeah.
it's annoying not to be able to capture those same like sync the cameras up to exactly sub frame accuracy.
And this is an issue even with things like Colors, Autopano software, and I deal with this all the time when I'm doing immersive video stuff. We normally capture at 80 frames per second because that's as fast as it will go. And even then, you still occasionally have issues with the frame rate not being fast enough because you're not syncing the cameras. But
And God forbid if someone has a flash gun in the room, starts taking photos, and there's half your image is flashing and half isn't, and you've got
Yeah.
these quadrants that are, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's reasons why this Pterodact thing is good though, because in the future you might have cameras which you can gen lock and you can put together and sync up. Maybe those little Blackmagic little
The
tiny
micro,
micro ones
whatever.
might have the
Yeah.
ability to have a gen lock thing in the future. So it gives you the option to do that, and I like the idea of it.
Look, the iPad software looks reasonably good because you can make adjustments on the fly. So this is all real time stuff, and you can adjust the contrast and the exposure and all that sort of standard stuff. But you can also play with the stitching and how that's actually occurring, which is good. So you can refine the stitching a little bit. Still the same old problems with the 360 immersive video stuff. You can't have stuff that's too close to the lens, otherwise you get these weird parallax issues and so on and so forth. However, I think possibly live immersive video is more interesting than pre-produced immersive video because the sort of things it's actually good for, I think lend themselves a lot more to live.
Because in post stuff, you're there as the producer to give the viewer the best experience by cutting and chopping
Making
stuff
decisions.
around and making decisions for the people watching. That's what editors do. And that's what
Well, I just thought, imagine a Lightro VR camera. That would be the most lazy camera you could possibly use.
Oh my God.
Just do everything in post.
It could get the shot later,
all up
could
to
get
the
the
user.
focus later,
Yeah.
could get the exposure later. Wow. And it streams at 3 times? It'd be like 2 terabytes a second.
Yeah. Yep.
And $2 billion. Anyway, so that's the Pterodact 360 encoding box. It's pretty cool. I'm pretty excited about it.
Yeah, it looks interesting. The other thing, one of the other things that we saw that we thought was kind of interesting at the show was the Kinefinity Terra, which is, I'm going to call it a red ripoff. I'm probably being very harsh, and I don't necessarily mean that in a harsh way. It's just the impression I get from this camera. As far as I can ascertain, it's a camera that's been developed very cheaply, which is great, to be very similar to a Red camera in that it's a brain box sensor beast thing with a very touchscreen driven interface that does high resolution and reasonably high frames per second.
Yep, straight out of China. It's a super 35mm sensor. The guy who was demoing it, there was just some it was very interesting to watch the interviews because he's just standing there with this camera and it's done it for a few interviews and people just ask some questions and they sort of give answers, but there doesn't seem to be a very solid repository of information on a central database site
it feels very much like a camera
prototype
off the shelf sort of parts that maybe it does, maybe we're wrong, but it doesn't seem to have the infrastructure or the fleshing out of software around it. It seems very much like, okay, this is a prototype camera, it does this stuff, but we haven't really worked out how that is applicable to the real world yet.
So it's got its own custom RAW codec, a 12-bit Kine RAW format that, as far as I know, I don't know if Resolve supports it or what supports it actually. I mean, there's no information really yet. It does record ProRes internally if you choose it to. And it can do up to 60 frames a second at 6K. Now that is very impressive.
Yeah.
100 frames at 4K and 225 frames at 2K, which is quite
reasonable. Yeah.
And it looks like it's a nice sensor. It's got a swappable mounting system on it, so you can choose between EF, PL, and Nikon mount.
Yep.
So there's lots of mounting options. It's a very small footprint, like the camera's really small.
It's like a DSLR if you sort of squished it and made it square.
Yeah, and it has a single D-pad on the side with a sort of range of semi-labeled buttons. And it looks like it's a very, very menu-driven camera.
Yeah.
So very much aimed at the cinema kind of style shooting.
It looks very red. There are not many buttons. You access most things. You can control a heck of a lot, but it all has to be through the menu.
And, of course, finally, the output options. Yes, it has HD SDI, HDMI, 4K output. Timecode options for doing timecode sync and jam. Well, at least it has the inputs and outputs. Whether they're all actually implemented in software yet, it's hard to tell because there's no real-world demos of it actually running. They didn't actually have that at NAB. But there is a little proprietary monitor that it's going to come with as well that allows you to slap this little monitor on top. Whether it's touchscreen, we don't know.
I think it'll have to be, otherwise you won't be able to do much with it.
Yeah, it's an interesting looking camera. I mean, they've said $6K for $6,000, $5K for $5,000 is their kind of punchline.
Well, Blackmagic did 4K for 4K a couple of years ago, so this is 5 for 5 and 6 for 6.
But what the camera actually is, we're still trying to figure it out. They've got some semi-working kind of demo the guy was walking with at NAB and just showing people. So, yeah, let's see where that goes in the future.
Next on to Sony's facial recognition in specifically the A6300 model. Now, this is not so much news, but a story I saw, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Point and shoot camera.
It's a point and shoot camera. The same technology, I believe, is on a couple of their other cameras. But the idea here is that Sony's had facial recognition, along with many other companies, for a long time, and that's useful in that you can turn it on and the autofocus then takes priority on people's faces. So it tries to track a face when it sees it and focus on that face. The problem is, what if you've got 6 faces in the scene? Which face do you actually focus on? And the idea here is that you could actually register a face, and in addition to detecting a face, a generic face, it actually can detect more accurately a person. In a use case scenario, the idea is a wedding shoot potentially. So you could register prior to the event the groom and the bride, and that way it doesn't matter what the guests are doing. The camera's going to go, well, bugger them. They got faces, but I don't care. I've got this bride's face registered, and I'm going to focus on her. So look, it's just another tool, I guess, in the arsenal. But for anything you are having to run on autofocus for whatever reason, it seems like it could be a useful feature, Chris.
Yeah. Look, I mean, honestly, the multi-point autofocus where you just, bang the dot on what you want to focus on and press the button still seems to me like a better idea.
What if it's an unmanned camera?
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah, you got me there.
Oh.
Cool.
No, moving on.
Hypothetically, yeah.
Yes,
all right.
yeah, all right.
Yeah, that'll do.
All right. Atomos, Chris, announces the 4K flagship Shogun Inferno. What is with video products and kind of like intense violent names?
Well, that's like Flame or Smoke. I mean, the
Ninja, Shogun. Yeah, there's lots of them. We mentioned this a little bit earlier in the show, so we won't dwell on it. Basically, it's a new high-end monitor from the Atomos guys, and it supports HDR, which is kind of cool. The HDR standards are really not defined. People are sort of suggesting that the absolute minimum for an HDR screen is 1,000 nits.
Or 800 sort of ish for the...
Yep, Dolby's talking about 4,000 and striving for 10,000. This is 1,500, which is pretty impressive in a little portable display. Yep. So it's a $2,000 US unit, does 4K, has lots of nice features, looks pretty robust. And the HDR edition is very nice. They also announced, and this isn't on our notes, Chris, that they're releasing a free update for all of their recorders to support HDR.
I've read that,
except for the Ninja.
That was sort of a bit before the ability to have lookup tables and stuff on it. Yeah. Now, my thing with these HDR screens, when you've got something that's as bright as 1,500 nits, are you going to use it as an HDR monitor, or are you actually just going to use it in direct sunlight with it cranked right the way to its high brightness?
Yeah.
That's, to me, its killer feature. This is the brightest portable monitor out there. It's going to be so useful to have a screen that's that bright, especially when you're, even with just a little shield on it, when it's a super bright day and you're in direct sunlight, what a cool thing to have something that bright. And yes, it does HDR as well. So,
yes,
as far as I'm concerned, that's just a really cool bright monitor.
Yep.
John, we got a part 2 coming up. What's happening?
We do indeed, Chris. We haven't even got to Black Magic yet, and we know it's not NAB really without Black Magic. So join us for part 2, where we'll get stuck into all their announcements.
And we have literally as many pages dedicated to their products as we do to the rest of NAB. So, going to be a big show, John.
Indeed.
Purple Fringe, where we discuss the high end of my mobile phone. Hang on.
G'day, Chris speaking. Hey, yay! How you doing, man?